If you're just signaling to the market that, hey, we're Google, this is Toyota, we want to get to privately owned autonomous vehicles. And we're not talking about some random autonomy company. We're talking about Waymo, where people can get into a car today and go to sleep and have true autonomy. That is a momentous occasion, regardless of where they are in the stage of signing that agreement.
True. That's very true. If and when they do sign that potential strategic agreement, does that force a pivot throughout the rest of the industry where you have ramifications that go far and wide?
I mean, I would absolutely. I think that's already happening. I mean, we're seeing announcements, it feels like every other day, which is why you were joking earlier about how to do 2 podcasts a week. I mean, the question I have is Toyota's not new to the game, right? Toyota has a relationship with May Mobility, which we will talk about later. You know, they have a relationship with Aurora, and Aurora just had a major milestone, which we will talk about later. Toyota's is deep in this. Where are the other OEMs, and does it put pressure on them? I think it was like Ford that I think backburnered a lot of their autonomous or even their ADAS plans in their cars. You know, should there be, or is there probably in the boardrooms and at the management level, a lot of questions being asked about what their future is? Because, you know, if we're talking about private autonomous ownership, you know, this is a structural change to the industry. I mean, if you have a car that can drive you on your commute in the morning and then go home and be available for other members of your family, it reduces the number of cars you have to purchase. It's that simple.
It's a game-changing moment on the Ford thing. Pete Bigelow texted me from Automotive News today and said, what's going on? Ford shut down their automotive electrical platform that was built by Doug Field, ex-Apple, shut it down. Their autonomy program is all shut down, which leaves no path for Ford in autonomy but licensing. Does this validate Neuro's pivot to licensing and Wave's business model just to purely focus on licensing? Is this another validation in the market?
I mean, obviously, depending on what your bias is, you could try and use this to validate whatever you want. To me, the primary one is private ownership. In terms of all these other companies, you know, everyone's making decisions, and this is not the only business model that I think, you know, can or is going to work. There's advantages and there's disadvantages. It just puts more pressure on perhaps other OEMs to find additional partners. And I think, as we've talked about on this podcast, and as I've written in some recent notes, the key thing to consider is that we haven't seen any exclusivity, right? So it's probable that there's going to be multiple partnerships on both sides, meaning May Mobility using Uber and Lyft, you know, Toyota using multiple technology partners, Uber, you know, using multiple technology partners. So I think everyone's going to want to place their bets. Maybe you have one really strong bet, and then you have others that are at a minimum a stalking horse, but maybe you just don't know which solution is going to win. At the end of the day, like, and again, we've talked about this on many episodes for our longtime listeners about how AI and what I'm calling Autonomy 2.0 and how that's changing the pace and the cost of development. You know, it's exciting time.
It's exciting times. You're right. You want to test. But I have to ask this because let's go back in history to 2020. Waymo signed an exclusive deal with Volvo Cars to be the L4 provider. Nothing came of that. That's 5 years. Will Toyota be the same thing in 5 years, or is Waymo really going to get their act together and do something this time?
I mean, I don't know if, first of all, it is exclusive. So I don't think it's exclusive. I guess could evolve that way, right? It's a preliminary agreement. I don't know. We could go that route. Grayson, the topic I'm more interested in talking about is that, you know, if this is a kind of pivot towards private ownership, is Waymo One as a concept, meaning Google having this massive Robotaxi fleet, is that toast now? Is this like, okay, we have this path on licensing and selling cars, and does this help maybe Uber, you know, become more likely of a partner in, you know, in whatever markets Google decides to go to? It almost kind of reminds me of Google Fiber. Google Fiber was building fiber to compete with the cable companies in DSL. And when they originally started, it was like, oh my God, Google is going to overbuild everybody and be a competitor. And really all they did was do it in a couple of markets to inspire capital investment, to get regulators to put more pressure on, you know, building out fiber. And I think that was ultimately successful. You got fiber building from, you know, AT&T and, you know, private equity, and T-Mobile's funding some stuff. So maybe this is kind of a signal that Waymo One is really not the long-term strategy for that company. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I was involved in a Google Fiber deal back in the day. And I will tell you point blank, it became very obvious to us after a few months that Google Fiber had no interest. They were using us as a bargaining chip. But they did build out Austin. They did build out really Provo, Utah. They built out some really strange markets.
Kansas City. Kansas City was an early one. Yep.
So they built out these strange markets. They commercialized them. But what Waymo One is doing, they're building out strategic markets. So I'm unsure. Now I'm going to put the crazy hat on. Do we get to a point where Alphabet perhaps sells Waymo to Uber at some point and merges the Waymo One app into Uber?
I mean, that's certainly possible. I wouldn't rule anything out at this point, but that's why this preliminary agreement, I think, is so interesting. It gives you at least a little better insight or a reason to rethink what your preconceived notions may have been about what Google's longer term strategy is. The thing that I've been focused on is getting more cars. So I'm hopeful that when this preliminary agreement continues and discussions continue to get to final point, that part of that is, hey, Toyota, send us some cars that we can either outfit or put on a, development timeline to integrate, for use, whether it's in our network or if, Uber wants to run the network and you have a third party own the network. So sourcing cars, I think, it will be interesting. There was obviously no mention of that. And of course, the relevance of this, as our long-term listeners know, goes back to the unforced error of Waymo of selecting Zeekr, a Chinese EV car manufacturer, which obviously could face some restrictions in terms of even receiving them, let alone how much they're going to cost, given that they're made in China.
As Waymo goes down this pivot, we have public data that says in 2026 they'll begin taking ownership possession of the Hyundai vehicles and they'll be testing them, with more ramping up in 27. Could we potentially see a follow-on release where Hyundai is going to work with Waymo to build a personally owned Ioniq 5 autonomous vehicle?
That is a great question. And if I'm senior management or in charge of that partnership at Hyundai, aren't I getting on the call with Waymo, with Google? I mean, like, what the fuck? Like, I was supposed to be doing, vehicles for you to have in your fleet, and now you're going to be selling cars that are going to compete with me on that side. So absolutely. Like, why would you go through that whole technology integration that Hyundai is doing? And we've seen the cars. We saw them at CES. I think we've seen some cars on Reddit, and not try and benefit from being able to sell those to your customers.